Hello and welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to start talking a little bit about some biases and methodological errors in scholarship that are not anti-supernatural bias. And I think that's important. I think it's important to point out the fact that there are these problematic methodologies in scholarship that cannot be attributed to an anti-supernatural bias on the part of at least many of the scholars who have the problem. I think that's important because if we think of anti-supernatural bias as the only source of problematic methodology in biblical studies, that can make us completely open to anything that is suggested by a scholar who doesn't have a anti-supernatural bias. A scholar who's a Christian, for example, will say, well, he's a Christian, so he can't have an anti-supernatural bias. And then what will happen is people will even think, well, and then that scholar is suggesting something that we might think sounds kind of liberal when we first hear it, or might get characterized that way. But since he doesn't have an anti-supernatural bias, the arguments for it must be really strong. So that we tacitly treat that as somehow a testimony against interest, in a sense, on the part of that scholar. And that's not accurate, because actually there's an enormous amount of peer pressure within scholarship, even among Christian scholars, in the direction of certain methodologies and approaches. And so actually by adopting those approaches, the person is kind of going with the flow. He's not going against interest, and he's not necessarily demanding extra strong arguments. And so something I've found when I've looked into these things is that the arguments that are used by conservative labeled scholars are just as bad as the ones used by liberal labeled scholars. I especially found this when I was researching the Gospel of John. So arguments that John, invented Jesus' words, or loosely paraphrased, quote unquote, made up things and so forth, and put them into Jesus' mouth. When advocated by conservative labeled scholars, they were just the same poor arguments that were being made by liberal labeled scholars. So we really need to get away from this idea that an anti-supernatural bias is the only one we need to be thinking about or be on the alert for. Now, historically, it may be true that some of these bad methodologies became part of the discipline originally as a result of an anti-supernatural bias. As a sort of an origin story, I think that sometimes is true. David Friedrich Strauss had an enormous influence upon gospel scholarship, New Testament scholarship, and he had a blatant anti-miracle bias. But he instituted certain approaches, like being against harmonization, that have outlasted and have become disconnected from a specific anti-miraculous bias, so that anti-harmonistic bias is present even among scholars who are not against miracles, who accept miracles. I've been known to say that particularly when you get a strong continuationist, like, say, Dr. Keener, for example, that he is more open to the idea that people have been raised from the dead in modern times than he is to the idea that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. And I used to say that kind of wryly, but I think there's actually truth there. That someone has been raised from the dead, and I'm not here talking about Jesus, I'm talking about like modern miracles, should have a pretty high burden of proof to fulfill. That Jesus cleansed the temple twice is not really that improbable. It's not a miracle. It's a protest act. It's not anything that should be considered really bizarre or really strange. And yet Dr. Keener is quite definite that Jesus only cleansed the temple once and John moved the temple cleansing. He seems to have a higher burden of proof there than for modern miracles, I think. And that just strikes me as odd. But it shows, it illustrates what I'm saying about an anti-supernatural bias not being the only bias we need to be thinking about. So today I want to introduce the bias against events that are broadly similar that happen more than once. I have an entire YouTube playlist on the temple cleansing. I took it from, every possible angle. I will try to remember to link that in the show notes below here. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the temple cleansing, though I think that illustrates this issue. The two temple cleansings are only broadly similar. They're not uncannily similar as described by John and the Synoptic Gospels, so there easily could have been more than one. But there's just this very strong implication that that's weird. Today, I'm just going to give 3 social ways in which this bias is passed down, maybe even unconsciously, against more than one broadly similar event. So the first way that this is passed down socially is by bringing up wildly implausible instances of duplicate events that no one is actually advocating and dragging that in as if that's the kind of thing that a harmonizer would advocate. Now, I've seen this done repeatedly. I've seen Bart Ehrman do it. Dr. Licona does it in a lecture that at least was online up until recently, maybe still is online, where he's talking about his compositional devices. He talks about the raising of Jairus' daughter. And there's this very trivial wording difference at the beginning. When did Jairus say, my daughter has just died, or my daughter's about to die? And Dr. Licona says something like, well, was Jesus' miraculous power maybe a little off that day, and he raised Jairus' daughter, and then she died again, and then he had to raise her again? As far as I know, nobody advocates that. I don't know if anybody's ever advocated that. Why even bring it up? It's not a harmonization that one would use, even for that trivial alleged discrepancy about the language. My favorite harmonization there is one suggested by my husband Tim, that Jairus is very upset and he's, almost babbling. My daughter is at the point of death. By now she's probably just died, while I was coming to get you, etc. So the idea that she died twice and Jesus raised her twice is a straw man of harmonization there. It also casts aspersions on any sort of use of more than one generally similar event. Oh, you think that thing happened twice? Yeah, I bet you're the kind of person who would think that Jairus' daughter died twice and Jesus raised her twice, that kind of thing. I think I've seen Dr. Keener do it in Christobiography. If I recall correctly, it's concerning the cursing of the fig tree. Oh, did Jesus maybe curse 2 fig trees? And I don't know of anybody who's ever alleged that Jesus cursed 2 fig trees in succession during Holy Week. So that is, I think, an illicit way of indicating and perpetuating a bias against more than one broadly similar event, is by bringing up ridiculous examples that nobody's advocating and sneering at them. Okay, so that's not good, but it shows how that bias is there, how it's ingrained. Second way that this is done is just by declaring anything of that kind strained in a given case. So we find this in a online, I believe it's a Defender's transcript. by Dr. William Lane Craig concerning the temple cleansing, where he says something like, when I was younger, I used to think Jesus cleansed the temple twice, but we don't need to adopt any such strained and artificial harmonization as that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. These are the same event, and he just moves on. And that's by no means obvious, nor is it only some kind of fundamentalist who brings this up. I linked in my long series on the temple cleansing an article by Allan Chapple, which I will link here, if I remember, in the show notes, about the temple cleansings. And he notes a bunch of differences between them. They're really just broadly similarly described. Craig Blomberg has said something similar. Now, I believe Blomberg is open to the idea of what's I would call it achronological moving. I don't think that's a good solution. But he also notes that it's not stupid to think that Jesus might have cleansed the temple twice, and that except for words that would be needed to describe two broadly similar events, there aren't a lot of uncanny resemblances. But Dr. Craig talks as though the resemblances are so exact and precise and uncanny that it would be silly, to think that in John and in the synoptics, they're referring to two different events. And that's just not true. It's dismissive. So that's the second way that this bias is perpetuated. A third way that this bias is perpetuated, which I haven't seen in public, but which was used with me in private correspondence, was the phrase, how often are you going to do that? So I was having a correspondence with a biblical scholar. I'm not going to name him because he hasn't put this out there anywhere in public. And I had written to him asking his opinion concerning the temple cleansing. And he began kind of throwing at me various other cases. The conversation kind of webbed, whereas I was just asking about one thing, but he wanted to bring up a lot of other things where some scholars believe that something was moved. And he was seeming to have real problems with the achronological, dyschronological distinction. And in all of the cases that he brought up, I said that in those cases I suspected that there were two broadly similar events. And I think there were 3 or 4 that he brought up, or that we were discussing, including the temple cleansing. And at a certain point he said, how often are you going to do that? And that's interesting, isn't it? I've never forgotten that. How often are you going to do that? So what does that communicate? First of all, it communicates condescension. And I was very struck by it because I've often thought since then of what sort of pressure this would represent to someone who was a student, say, of that person. This is a Christian scholar. This is not someone with an anti-miraculous bias, okay? But you could be left sort of tongue-tied if you were in a powerless position vis-a-vis this person. Now, I don't care, all right? I'm a honey badger. Honey badger don't care. Analytic philosophers tend to be honey badgers. So it didn't intimidate me, but it was a very intimidating thing to say. What other answer is there that you could give to that other than I'm going to do that as often as I think the evidence supports it, right? I'm going to do it as often as but it's meant to sort of leave you tongue-tied. And the second thing that communicates, which is related, is that there's a bag limit on the number of times that you're allowed to invoke the notion of two broadly similar events. Like, again, if you were a student, you might think, oh, how often am I going to do that? Maybe I'm not supposed to do that too often. Am I doing that too often? Oh, I'm so sorry, right? And I mean, the answer that it's obviously looking for is exactly that. what else are you going to say? 5. How often am I going to do that? 5. And no more, sir. And I'll let the Guild of New Testament Scholarship tell me if it counts as one of my 5. And if I'm using it too often, I'll be sure to be careful about that. Not to do it more than 5. Oh, 5 is too much? Or maybe 3. And that's ridiculous. If you look at ordinary life, broadly similar events happen a lot. They happen often. There is no bag limit to the number of times that you're allowed to invoke that. But that is a third way in which this bias is perpetuated. Well, how often are you going to do that? One might, with more justice, ask in return, how often are you going to suggest that an author moved something, either achronologically or dyschronologically? How often are you going to refuse to acknowledge the distinction between achronological and dyschronological moving? How often are you going to reject 2 broadly similar events? In and of itself, how often are you going to do that? Has no force. It has no argumentative force. It has only social force. So I wanted to bring these out because they show, again, that anti-miraculous bias is not the only social way in which poor methodology gets passed down from generation to generation, from one person to another person. Now, one of the instances that I was discussing with that scholar was Jesus' rejection at his hometown of Nazareth. I want to be careful how I say this. If I say the rejection at Nazareth, that, of course, implies that there was only one time. And that's exactly what I want to discuss. But I'll do that next time. That one, I would say, is a little more of a gray area than the temple cleansing. I think it's obvious that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, but I'm not saying that without argument. I have playlists on it. I've argued for it. But it's certainly obvious with the temple cleansing that John and the synoptics are indicating different times. So to my mind, the real question concerning Jesus' rejection at Nazareth is whether there's some achronological narration going on there. But I don't think that the 2 instances are uncannily similar to the point that it is out of court to suggest 2 broadly similar events. So I want to go into that next time in some detail because, as far as I can recall, I've never discussed that particular incident. This has been an introduction to this. So the 3 ways, the first is by straw manning, by talking about obviously silly duplications of events. The second is by just saying, well, that's strained without argument in a case where it's not strained. And the third is, how often are you going to do that? I hope that with that introduction, you'll be interested to come back to hear some thoughts on Jesus' rejection at Nazareth once or twice. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Lydia McGrew.